kiddos. So today we are starting um, the Union and Peril. This is the time period from 1848 to 1861, where this growing sectionalism that we've been talking about for really the last about 20 years of history is kind of coming to a head politically. So we've talked about the economic sectionalism that exists between the North, the South, the West a little bit, and how regions of the country have argued over and more, what to do over tariffs and the bank. We've talked about the industrial North versus the agrarian South for most of pretty much the entire curriculum so far. But really what now we're looking at as America is expanding westward and as they are gaining new territories like Texas and California, the Band-Aid of the Missouri Compromise is no longer going to be sufficient in healing the wound that is the question of slavery. And so in this lecture, we're really going to be talking about the political compromises and failures and events that are going to lead to a civil war in the United States. So there are four main causes of this conflict between the North and the South. The number one issue is going to be the issue of slavery and the extension of slavery in the West in particular. I want to make it very clear that even though slavery is kind of this growing moral issue in the North, it had a lot to do with slavery expanding in the West for economic reasons as well. Remember that a lot of the people that are moving into the West, they want economic opportunity for themselves. They don't want it for free Blacks. They don't want it for slave owners. They want it open to what we call free labor. In the South, they are very defensive. They believe that Northerners want to first prohibit slavery in the West so that they can gain more political control in Congress, so that then how they justified is they believe that Northerners would want to abolish slavery where it existed. Most Whigs, Republicans, even as we get closer to the war, even in 1860, Republicans really didn't have any interest in abolishing slavery in the places that it already exists, mostly because it was kind of a legal issue. Like, do they have the legal right to do it? Most did not think that they did, but they did believe that they had the ability to limit it in the West. And so that's the constitutional dispute. Is it a state's right versus the federal government and how to handle the issue of slavery? Oftentimes you'll hear people say that the Civil War wasn't over slavery, it was over states' rights and the constitutional protection for Southerners to take their property where they wanted it, right? To not deny them to their property. Now, granted, these are human beings that they're considering their property. And so even if you argue that, okay, it's about states' rights, in most cases, it was about a state's right to expand slavery or to own slaves. And the same thing with economic differences. Yes, there is a growing difference between this industrial North with paid labor or free labor, as they called it at that point in time, versus the Southern states who use their capital and invest it in enslaved people and in land. With those same issues, we've talked about already the growing differences between tariffs, like the tariff abominations, the Bank of the United States. How are they going to spend federal tax dollars? And again, that even kind of overlaps within kind of the states' rights view. So if you think about Calhoun and the nullification crisis, that relates to constitutional disputes, but also these economic differences. And then really what we're going to talk about today are political blunders and extremism, people reacting to one another, North and South. There's going to be a lot of violence, a lot of tension leading up to the 1860 election, which will eventually lead to South Carolina seceding and a civil war beginning, 4 bloody years of civil war. So these are your main 4 causes. I would make sure that you understand how they overlap, what they have to do with one another. And then I would also make sure that you can provide specific factual information, SFI, as evidence to support how did slavery increase division? How did constitutional disputes increase division, and so forth? So let's start with these new territories. We're moving westward. The United States has annexed Texas. They've gone to war with Mexico and obtained the Mexican cessions, so present-day California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, etc. And there are basically three conflicting positions on how the existing states and leaders and the people view solving this problem. So one is going to be the free soil movement. So you have a lot of Northern Democrats and Whigs. And what we're also going to see during this time is the breakup of a lot of political parties. Politics is a pendulum, right? It's reactionary. And so political parties at this point in time are reacting to what is going on in the West, and new political parties are going to be formed. One of those parties is the Free Soil Party. Again, it's kind of a combination of Northern Democrats and Whigs. They were in favor of the Wilmot Proviso. So remember that the Wilmot Proviso would have banned slavery in any territory won from the Mexican War. And Southerners really saw this as an attack. And so that's why it was not passed, but it heightened the tension for sure. It's going to lead to a very defensive approach to, like, Southerners are just concerned, like, why do you want to ban slavery in the West? And they start talking about it as a constitutional issue and property. So many Northerners are going to oppose expansion of slavery, mostly because of economic reasons. They want that land opened to immigrants, because remember, immigrants are flooding into those northern cities. There's a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. We'll talk about xenophobia and the Know Nothing Party a little bit later. And they want to keep that land open, not only for native-born citizens that are looking for economic opportunity and manifest destiny, but also for immigrants to kind of move in that direction, which means that they do not want what happened in the South to happen in the West. One of the reasons that immigrants are going into those northern cities is to avoid the fact that there aren't very many economic opportunities for them in the South, because they would have to compete with slave labor. So they want free soil, free labor, free men in the West in order to kind of expand their economy that way, where the slave economy and slave labor is not going to create economic opportunity for anyone in the West except for the major slave owners and planters that already exist in the South. So the second position is going to be that of the Southerners. And remember that they're very defensive at this point in time. You have the abolitionist movement and free soilers that are attempting to restrict slavery in the West. And they believe that that is now a constitutional issue. It's interesting because Southerners, their view on the justification of slavery kind of evolves over time. Like, at first, it's primarily this economic defense, where it's like, oh, well, it's, this necessary evil, and, like, it'll die out. And then it becomes this social, religious justification, where, like, they believe that it's a positive good that they're doing, that they're providing things for these people that they deemed as inferior. They talked a lot about the slave wages in the North, in the industrial North, and how it's much more humane to be able to provide for them everything that they need. They just lack their freedom, which we know is kind of ridiculous. Now, though, it's becoming a political issue, where they consider it a constitutional protection of property in the Western states, that you can't tell someone where they can and cannot take their property. And then the third option is going to be popular sovereignty. So Lewis Cass, a Democrat, a Northern Democrat, suggested a solution to the problem, which is let the people in the territory in question decide if they want to be a slave state or a free state, instead of allowing Congress to decide, right? So it's just deciding on, at that point in time, are there more Northerners or more Southerners in Congress? Instead, let the people that are living in that territory decide if they want it to be a slave state or a free state. And a lot of people liked it. Moderate Southerners and moderate Northerners kind of liked the idea. It seemed very democratic. You'll come to find out why it didn't end up working. But that's the third position on expansion of slavery in the West. Now, in 1848, all of these issues are going to kind of come to a head. So the Whig Party nominated war hero Zachary Taylor, never been in politics before. The Whig Party completely ignored the issue of slavery expanding into the West. Because they knew it was going to divide them a little bit. And the Democrats are going to nominate Lewis Cass. So that kind of shows you the support that a lot of Democrats felt towards popular sovereignty at the time. Then Martin Van Buren decided to kind of pop in with this free soil movement that kind of threw everything into array. And the Democrats called them barn burners because they pulled votes from those Northern Democrats. So instead of voting for Cass, they're going to vote for Van Buren. So they were called barn burners because they threatened to dismantle the Democratic Party. So Zachary Taylor is going to end up winning, mostly because Van Buren's going to take some votes from New York and Pennsylvania, which would otherwise probably have gone for Lewis Cass, the Democrat. So the first major conflict that we're going to have about the extension of slavery into new states is really going to be had over California. We haven't had a major dispute because of the Missouri Compromise that was passed back in 1820. Remember that the Missouri Compromise only dealt with, at that point in time, the Louisiana Purchase, because that was the extent of our most westward border. But now, as we've gained Texas and basically the entire West Coast with the Oregon Treaty and the Mexican Cession, how are we going to determine the Missouri Compromise in that regard? Some people said that it should just kind of stay consistent. But in California in particular, it's also more complex because we gained the territory in 1848. Gold is also discovered at that same point in time. You have the gold rush, where over 100,000 people rush into California. And really by 1849, 1850, they now have a large enough population to apply for statehood. So it happens very quickly. And so California drafts a constitution banning slavery. If you think about the people that are moving into that territory, they're looking for economic opportunity. There's possibility that you could have plantations and slave labor, but those aren't the people that have moved into that territory. So they're applying to the United States to be admitted to the Union as a state, as a free state. Now, President Taylor, even though he is a Southern slave owner, he did support California and their constitution, as well as New Mexico and eventually Arizona. And so in response to that, a lot of Southerners were upset and they were called fire eaters, but they started talking about secession this early in 1850. And so the great compromiser shows up and he's like, okay, listen, we can negotiate this out. And so he proposes the compromise of 1850. And it's basically this combination of the Northerners are going to get, a free state of California, for example, while the Southerners need something to kind of balance that out. The two main parts of the compromise of 1850 that I think that you should for sure know is that California is admitted as a free state and the fugitive slave law. So at this point in time, the Underground Railroad is happening, and they know it, even though it's not a large amount of enslaved people escaping successfully into northern states. What they don't like is the principle of it, the principle of the fact that there are Northerners that are not only helping enslaved people escape into the North, but that they support it and they kind of condone this type of behavior, basically breaking the law. Because the fugitive slave law was originally passed back in the 1790s. It's just been very loosely enforced over the last 150 plus years. Almost 100 years. And so that is the principle of that is something that really bothers them. That's really kind of the main compromise. In other regards, so they divide New Mexico into 2 territories and they allow popular sovereignty there. So basically it'll become kind of like New Mexico and, well, you got Arizona and Utah in there as well. And DC was a hotbed issue because a lot of Northerners, and especially like abolitionists, and this might have even been a part of, I'm not saying that Jefferson thought this through that well, but if you think about why Jefferson was willing to allow Hamilton's economic plan to be passed, his compromise was to move the capital south so that Southerners and rural people wouldn't move to the big city and kind of forget their constituents. Instead, because they were kind of seen as they're the majority, but they were not the majority in kind of that elite governing body. And so they wanted, when he made that decision, he wanted it to where rural these elite legislators, and this was his time period, if you think about it, are coming into the South and they are viewing kind of a more rural way of life or a Southern way of life. So these abolitionists being elected in, you know, upstate New York are coming into, you know, the Potomac region, and they can hear, like, as they're governing, they can hear the slave trade taking place outside of the open windows. And that was something that really bothered a lot of people, even if you weren't an abolitionist, but you, like, just to be able to see that for the first time in your life, you've probably heard of it, but to actually see it, that was something that was very troublesome. So part of the compromise also was to ban the slave trade within the District of Columbia. However, if you owned slaves, that you could still own slaves. So that was kind of a compromise. Now, granted, like, if you are a slave owner in DC, all you have to do is walk like the 2 miles across the Potomac River into Virginia or north into Maryland, and you can purchase slaves. But they didn't want it happening within the boundaries of the District of Columbia. Okay, so that was what Henry Clay proposed. And the Senate's going to debate over it. The 3 giants of the age are going to debate the issue. So Henry Clay of Kentucky, who's obviously in favor of it. Daniel Webster, who was more of kind of like an abolitionist. And then John C. Calhoun, who is adamant about the expansion of slavery into the West. So Webster's going to argue for the compromise, but strictly to save the Union. And then you're going to start hearing this phrase, to preserve the Union, to save the Union. Calhoun is going to argue against it, saying that in the West, you know, you kind of the constitutional argument that you can't deny men their right to own property, and that equals equal rights, which is just crazy to me that that's one of his arguments, was equal rights. Senator Seward, who is an abolitionist, actually, he said that, you know, constitutionally speaking, there is a higher law. So he talked about kind of like more of the moral issue of allowing slavery to expand into the West. And this is going to be the last speeches for these 3 guys. So Clay is going to die. Webster and Calhoun are all going to die within 2 years of this debate being given. Taylor also dies in 1850. Originally, he was opposed to, because he saw what happened and how people responded when he was in favor of California. And so he's going to die. That's an interesting story. Millard Fillmore vice president, is going to be in favor of the compromise. And then this new guy, Stephen Douglas, is going to basically take the compromise, because what the thought was is we're just going to vote on the compromise of 1850, right? So just yes or no. Stephen Douglas came up with the idea instead to vote on each provision separately, because there was so much, and it wasn't like a party line thing, right? Like, there was division within the Whig Party about it. There was division within the Democratic Party. And so it wasn't a party line thing. Like, today we think, well, it's very simple. Like, you know, the vote's going to be based on Republicans and Democrats. Unfortunately, that's just the way things are today. That's not how it was at this point in time, with the divisiveness even within the political parties. And so that's what they did. They voted on each of the provisions separately, and then they were able to that way get the majority vote, because some people weren't going to vote for it just because of the Fugitive Slave Act. So maybe those Northern abolitionists didn't vote for that. They voted against that, but they voted for popular sovereignty, and they voted for California as a free state. And so that's how they were able to get that law passed. So part of this compromise in 1850, California was considered a free state. Basically, Southerners were willing to give that up as long as the fugitive slave law was strengthened. And so Northerners are going to respond to that. They're very upset. Kind of even think of it as like a states' rights type issue, which is kind of interesting because it's normally Southerners that are using that as a justification. The purpose of the law is to track down runaway slaves who had made their way into the North, or even like some, especially after this point, start making their way into Canada. And then you have people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman that were kind of like well known, even though they were a very small, I mean, we're talking about hundreds of runaways compared to the 4 million that are still in bondage. Again, it was kind of the principle of the fact that Northerners kind of condoned this behavior. So the law placed jurisdiction now within the federal government, and it allowed for special commissioners to issue warrants and arrest fugitives. So what they would do is they would go into these northern cities, and they, like Philadelphia, for example, and parts of upstate New York, and they would be on the lookout for fugitive slaves. And there are people that, you know, would help them in some way or the other. What's also interesting about this is, like, you didn't really have to have a ton of evidence in order to be able to find someone as a fugitive slave. So there were many cases where free Blacks were basically kind of thrown down south into slavery. So they would come in saying, like, this is Nelson, right? He meets the requirements. So-and-so said that he showed up at this point in time, and we think that he is, the property of John Smith in Virginia, or whatever it might be. Now, what's interesting here is there's no trial by jury either. So they're captured, they're taken to court, they're before a judge. And unfortunately, one of the things of this time period, and really kind of seeing the corruption with it, is that judges were actually paid more money for the case if the accused was found to be a fugitive slave. So they were paid $15 if they were if they found them guilty of being a fugitive slave, and they were paid $10 if they had been deemed a free Black, that was the wrong person. And so because of that, that kind of plays into something that I'm going to give multiple examples of this Southern power conspiracy, Southern conspiracy to kind of gain power. There are multiple examples. Texas was a part of it. The Mexican War was a part of that. If you think about, like, the Gadsden Purchase, of the Austin Manifesto, among some others that we're going to talk about today, is that there was a lot of corruption that kind of appeased Southerners in order to preserve the Union. And that's how Northerners kind of justified it. A lot of these legal issues and laws might have favored Southerners more in order to appease them and make sure that they didn't secede. Because remember, secession is something that's been talked about since the 1830s. And it really starts to heighten in the 1840s. We talked about the fire eaters. And this was one of those cases. So Southern states kind of react back, and they pass personal liberty laws to where they would, jack up make it difficult to go to court, right? Or they would have pro bono lawyers that would, like, draw out the case as long as possible to defend these accused fugitive slaves, in order to, because the Southerners would have to pay the court fees, right? So they would try to draw it out and say, like, oh, it's not worth the money. So they would do things like that in order to kind of counteract this federal law. So we've talked a little bit already about Hinton Rowan Helper's Impending Crisis of the South when we talked about sectionalism earlier in the year. But there are some books that are published during this time that definitely heighten the tension between the North and the South. Impending Crisis of the South is important because it's a Southerner writing about how slavery should be abolished, and it's talking to Southerners, talking about how economically how it hurts Southerners. But Uncle Tom's Cabin was interesting because Harriet Beecher Stowe is a Northern woman who had never really been in the South and actually seen slavery firsthand. She had heard stories. She'd spent some time in Indiana where people had kind of talked about it. But anyway, she wrote this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. It sold more copies than any other book in the 19th century, except for the Bible. The Bible is the only other book that sold more copies in that century. And so it's probably one of the most important, influential books in American history. And what it talked about was the story of a slave, Uncle Tom, and how his master brutally treated him. And what it did is it kind of, Northerners and Europeans, they were all fascinated with it. I kind of imagine it as like kind of like it was brutal and it was intense and it was deeply personal. And people just couldn't get enough of it. Whether it was 100% accurate or not, Southerners said that it's not like that at all. We know that there are examples, though, of slave owners brutally treating their enslaved population. But it kind of put a face, if you can imagine, as they're reading this story, it put a face with the institution where for a long time is kind of out of sight, out of mind. And the book created so much division between the North and the South that when Abraham Lincoln actually met Harriet Beecher Stowe after the war had started, he actually said to her, "So you're the little lady that started this big war," because it created a lot of resentment from Southerners, because again, they're saying like, you're telling these untruths, you're lying, you're, you don't know how we live and you don't understand. And like, talking about how slavery actually helps them. And so they're going to counterattack that by, again, talking about how it's a positive good. It's good for the master and the slave. They reference the Bible. They reference kind of that, wage labor in the North versus what they provide for their slaves in the South. The history of slavery, like they try to justify it in so many different ways, in addition to the political constitutional issues of like protecting property. Now, George Fitzhugh is probably the best known pro-slavery author, and he really focused on the fact that don't talk about equal rights, even though Northerners weren't talking about equal rights because they were pretty racist themselves. It was just kind of the moral issue of that they should be freed. There was no talk really early on, except for abolitionists and kind of radicals, about racial equality. But of course, the Southerners really focused on that. So they took the perspective of probably the minority of Northerners, and they tried to start like saying like, they believe in equality and like voting and like things like that. Like, what are you going to do if you give them your freedom? Are you going to give those men their voting rights? And that, like, people kind of lost their minds. But they're not. He considered them unequal men, that they don't deserve, that they're inferior. Two well-known books were Sociology for the South and then Cannibals All. This image that you see on this slide was always something that kind of stood out to me. This was like a piece of propaganda that you would see in a Southern newspaper. And this was the justification and the defense for the institution of slavery in the South. So in 1852, Whigs are still divided, not really trying to take much of a stance. They're still going after the war hero thing. So they pick Winfield Scott, who was a war hero from the Mexican-American War. And it's going to hurt their party. Democrats are going to nominate Franklin Pierce. And Franklin Pierce is actually one of, most times by presidential historians, has been ranked consistently at the bottom as probably one of the worst presidents in American history. Even though it's really interesting, you can see by how much he wins in that 1852 election. But I think it's more a reflection on the weakness of the Whig Party than it is unity in the Democratic Party. So just kind of keep that in mind. And really how Pierce kind of reacts to, starting in 1852 is when a lot of major events, especially starting with Kansas and Nebraska. And if you look at how he responded, it wasn't always in the best light. So Kansas-Nebraska Act. Democrats, as you could see from 1852 and then also in 1854, they have control of Congress and the White House. The Whig Party is drastically weak. And Senator Stephen Douglas, who is from Illinois, we'll talk a lot more about him, has basically wants to build a railroad that connects California to kind of the eastern market. So basically with a hub in Chicago. And that's what a lot of people think of Chicago with railroads. And it's for sure because of Stephen Douglas. So he wants to promote Western settlement though too, right? So it's kind of like you build it and they will come. But it'll also heavily benefit the state of Illinois in order to have this railroad leaving through Chicago. So he needs Southern approval, though, for a transcontinental railroad. But in order to get it through Chicago, it's got to have this like northern track. Okay, so if you remember when we talked about the Gadsden Purchase, how Southerners were in favor of purchasing that tiny strip of land, part of like the New Mexico territory, in order to have like a better proposition, right, to Congress saying, oh no, like we don't need to cut through mountains, we need to go this way. Well, Stephen Douglas doesn't want a southerly track, he wants a northern track. But Southerners are blocking the transcontinental railroad legislation because it goes through free territory. So Louisiana Purchase, so basically this orange territory where you see Kansas and Nebraska, that all, Missouri Compromise, that's where that covers that situation. So if it's north of that 3630 line, Nebraska and Kansas are going to be free. Okay. Well, Douglas knows that Douglas knows that Southerners don't want that area to be populated because if they build the railroad, the people come, they apply for statehood, and they're free states. Okay. So he's like, I need to get Southerners on board. So he introduced a bill that would, instead of basically repealing the Missouri Compromise, to where popular sovereignty would then be allowed to decide whether the territories in Kansas and Nebraska would be free or slave. So popular sovereignty, okay? Now, Southerners like this idea. Northerners were appalled by it, or especially like abolitionists or people that are anti-expansion of slavery, because it would repeal the Missouri Compromise, but Southerners really liked it because they're like, well, at least we have a shot now at gaining some slave states, even though like agriculturally it doesn't really make sense. But it was just this competition. Now, it didn't even logically or economically maybe make sense, but it was all about that political power. Okay, and this is going to create a ton of problems. Okay. They passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, popular sovereignty is the rule of law in those territories. Now, most of the people that lived in Kansas at this point in time were free soilers, right? Kind of consistent with everyone else that had kind of moved into those Western territories. They're mostly farmers from the Midwest. Most of them are anti-slavery. They want, free labor. They want economic opportunity for themselves as small farmers. However, slaveholders from Missouri had also started to migrate into Kansas, and it becomes this political pawn, if you will, in Kansas, where pro-slavery people are just moving into Kansas in order to vote, in order to make it a slave state. So to react to that, abolitionists in the North and free soilers in the North organized the New England Immigrant Aid Company, where they are raising money to send abolitionists to Kansas to live as settlers, right? To kind of support, it's like a GoFundMe, right? To move out there for the greater good so that they can vote and create a free state. And then it's just the division is gonna increase and increase. So soon fighting's gonna break out between these two groups. So the pro-slavery towns of Lecompton and the anti-slavery town of Topeka. Now, border ruffians were the Missourians, people from Missouri that would come in and basically promote this Lecompton Constitution, pro-slavery legislature, even though they knew at that time that it was illegitimate, that this was not how the majority of Kansas settlers felt. Lawrence was a anti-slavery town, and there was an attack there. John Brown, who we'll talk more about him, he was a radical abolitionist. He believed that God was telling him to basically kill slave owners. He goes into the Pottawatomie Creek area. He kills 5. Pro-slavery people attack the town of Lawrence, the sack of Lawrence, and kills some abolitionists there. And this is going to be known as Bleeding Kansas. So basically what you have, Kansas becomes, in the 1850s, like a microcosm of the country. And basically they have their own civil war in the country, and it's all in that state, and it's all because of like political reasons. If it weren't for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, people would have moved into Kansas, and they would have been corn farmers and wheat farmers, and it would have been a free state. But because Southerners, and this is kind of one of those examples, because of Prophet and Stephen Douglas, because Southerners saw an opportunity to gain more political control, it turned into this deadly situation. And the violence is going to extend not only in the West, but it's actually going to happen in the halls of Congress. So in 1856, Senator Charles Sumner, now Sumner was a abolitionist, staunch abolitionist. He was known for that, and he was kind of hated by, like, for sure, Southerners and Democrats. But he attacked the Democratic Party. So there's a response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He gives a speech in Congress titled "The Crime Against Kansas," and he goes on to talk pretty in depth about, and actually calls people out about how horrible what they did in Congress and the ramifications of it, and how it's the Democrats that are kind of at fault for what is happening in this country. It's kind of that Southern conspiracy, like slave power control argument. One of the people that he personally attacks is South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler. Now, Butler wasn't in Congress that day, okay? And one of the things that's really interesting about this time period, we talked a little bit about Southern chivalry and honor and how important that was to people, especially Southerners. And at this point in time, like, so you have to imagine that if you were to talk bad about someone, you are to do it to their face. You're not supposed to do it. It's dishonorable to do it otherwise. But here's the next thing. Butler wasn't there, but his nephew, Preston Brooks, who was in the House of Representatives, did hear it. And so part of the Southern chivalry and code of honor that exists at this point in time is if you hear someone talking bad about a family member or even a friend or whatever it is. So first of all, what Sumner did was dishonorable. But for Brooks to not react and defend his uncle would also be deemed dishonorable. And so Preston Brooks took it upon himself to defend that honor and went up to Charles Sumner, took his cane. And this is like, canes weren't for like you did have people that use them for what, but it was kind of like a status thing. It's like depending on how nice it is. Anyways, he took his cane that was, had silver and it was weighted and it was heavy. And he beats Sumner over the head so many times, like people had to like pull him off. Actually, there were people, it was so violent, like people were like holding people back from helping Sumner. He beat him over the head so many times that Sumner was never able to fully, he had brain damage. Like he wasn't able to fully recover. He sat absent in the United States Senate for 3 years as he learned to like talk and walk and, write and do all of and speak again. And Brooks was censured, which means basically like a slap on the wrist. That also shows you like how crazy Congress was, because why not kick him out for such an act? And Northerners obviously were upset about it, and they used it kind of this example. We'll talk about this political cartoon in class. However, Southerners were like, good job, right? They sent him canes to replace the one that he broke, beating Sumner up. And Brooks was quoted as saying that, so like dueling was still like, it was on the decline for sure. But people ask, well, why didn't you just duel him? Like, why did you, attack him in that way? That wasn't very gentlemanly. And he said that a duel would have been too good for Sumner. he deserved a beating like the dog that he was. Yeah, people, Sumner was a pretty controversial figure just because he was kind of a radical abolitionist at the time. So, as tension over slavery continued to divide the two main political parties of this period, you have the Democratic Party and the Whig Party. The Democrats are kind of divided like North and South. The Whigs really kind of, and that was over the issue of like popular sovereignty versus like pro expansion. The Whig Party just never really took much of a stance, and it was kind of also divided with the Know Nothing Party. A lot of people in the North were experiencing like, views of xenophobia, anti-immigrant views. They were discriminatory towards the large influx of immigrants, especially the Irish and their Catholic beliefs. And so the Know Nothing Party drew a lot of people away from the Whig Party, weakening them. You saw that in the 1852 election. And so they're also divided on this issue of slavery. You have some abolitionists, you have some Liberty Party members, you have people that are just anti-expansion. And the Know Nothings, though, are going to also help kind of divide the Whig Party leading up closer to the 1860 election. Now, the Republican Party was founded in opposition of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Whigs were too divided. They needed to take a clear stance. People weren't willing to do that. And so a lot of anti-expansion of slavery Whigs broke off and formed the Republican Party in 1854, 1855. It's a combination of free soilers, anti-slavery Whigs, anti-slavery Northern Democrats. And for example, like Abraham Lincoln was a Whig and then joined the Republican Party in the 1850s. Their number one goal is the opposition of slavery spreading into the West. And mostly it has to do kind of for economic reasons. And that's one of the similarities, I think, with the Republican Party of like Lincoln's Republican Party and the Republican Party of today. And that's pretty much about it. Is that economically they want to do what's best for business, especially big business. And you'll see that really start to be their focus after the Civil War. So they are going to call for the repeal of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, fugitive slave law. They're also going to be pro-tariff, like pro-business, where the government's going to step in and try to aid businesses. It's really going to be isolated to the North. And because of that, it's going to alienate the South, and that's what's going to kind of lead to the division. The Southerners really viewed the Republican Party as kind of a threat. And that'll be reflective in how they react to Lincoln winning in 1860. So presidential election of 1856 is the first test for the Republican Party. They nominate John C. Fremont of California, who played an important role in the Mexican-American War. And so we talked about their party platform already a little bit. Millard Fillmore, former president, is going to run with the Know Nothings. Now, they're going to receive 20% of the popular vote. Not going to do too well with the electoral, but still, they're pulling a lot of people away from the Republican Party. And then you have James Buchanan, another president that is going to be considered probably one of the worst. Both President Pierce and Stephen Douglas, their names are going to be too closely aligned with the controversy over Kansas, with Bleeding Kansas and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And so the Democratic Party chooses not to select them as their candidates at the convention. Buchanan is going to win, but notice that John C. Fremont, Republican, brand new party, a party that was basically formed over the issue of slavery in the West, where parties were ignoring the issue, and the Democratic Party is still going to kind of ignore it after this. This is a party that was formed because of the issue. And they are going to win 11 out of the 16 free states. And Southerners are starting to kind of notice a trend with that. And so it's kind of like foreshadowing a little bit. So an important thing that kind of happens, the first challenge to Buchanan's presidency is going to be the Lecompton Constitution, that artificial pro-slavery government that border ruffians and Missourians kind of threw together in order to try and get Kansas to be a slave state. Okay. And it did not have the majority, like the settlers were mostly free soilers. Buchanan, however, asked Congress to accept it. But even like certain Democrats in Congress were like, this is not right. This is not how country above party. Like, you just have to do the right thing. And so a lot of them saw it as illegitimate. They did not accept it. But this is one of the reasons that Buchanan was not very popular, is because he just basically supported the wrong positions. One of the most important Supreme Court cases of this unit and of this time period is going to be the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott is an enslaved man in Missouri, and his owner took him into Wisconsin Territory. So the territories were deemed free at this point in time. And he lived as a slave for 2 years before returning back to Missouri. Well, he decided to sue for his freedom in 1846. And 10 years later, it finally reached the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court basically decided to take on this case, and why it was kind of ignored for a while, because it was more conservative. It was also pretty Southern. Roger B. Taney was a Southern Democrat. He was believed that slavery was kind of that positive good that we've talked about before. And they wanted to, Supreme Court basically wanted to solve this problem once and for all and use judicial review. So they take the case, they listen to the arguments, and in the end, they rule against Dred Scott. And they then take it a little bit further. Have you ever heard of like legislating from the bench? That's something that people, and why Supreme Court nominees and why some people vote for president just based on if they're going to appoint conservative or liberal justices, so that maybe they can legislate from the bench. So if you think about, Roe versus Wade, or if you think about like the Affordable Health Care Act, like those are issues where there are laws, necessarily laws have been passed, but also the Supreme Court has the final say on it. And the Dred Scott case, that's what they were doing. So the first thing that Roger B. Taney in the opinion basically stated was that, first of all, African Americans are not citizens, and therefore you cannot sue in the federal court. So that was a constitutional issue. They said, you're not citizens. Second thing is, and this is very much the pro-Southern view, Congress does not have the authority to deprive any persons of property. Slaves are property, and Congress cannot deny that property in the federal territories. Now, states are different. So it basically rules the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. And what it does is all of the territory in all of those territories, like in yellow right there, as you can see, that it's pointing to. So Indian Territory, Oregon, Washington, Minnesota, okay? Federal government cannot deny slavery in those areas, okay? So it basically opens up slavery in the West. Southern Democrats were like, yes, finally, thank you. Somebody's listening to us. That totally makes sense. That's totally what the Constitution says. Northern Republicans are infuriated. They believe that this is an overreach. It is an abuse of power by the Supreme Court. It's that growing slave power conspiracy that has been increasing time and time again over the course of the last 2 decades. And after that, many Democrats in the North are going to convert to the Republican Party because they see the Democratic Party as a threat to the Union. And things start to kind of get more and more heated as we're heading towards 1860. But first, we need to talk about the Senate race in Illinois between Stephen Douglas, so that guy that we talked about with Kansas, Nebraska, and the railroads. He's running for re-election, and his challenger is Abraham Lincoln. Now, Abraham Lincoln was a Whig. He was not a very successful politician. Was a very good lawyer. Came from nothing. Used education, though, to lift himself up through the ranks of society. and was, served in the House of Representatives, lost re-election when he came and spoke out against the war with Mexico because he was worried about the American soil, American blood spilled on American soil. And he has decided to challenge Stephen Douglas. Now, he's a moderate Republican. He is not an abolitionist. He doesn't think legally the United States can do anything about slavery where it already exists. I mean, he's very, very analytical, but he does think that it should be restricted in the West and that Congress has the right to do that. He disagrees with the Dred Scott decision. So during these debates, they attracted tens of thousands of people. And in one of his most famous speech was this House Divided speech, where he talked about how slavery was immoral, and he was worried about just his major concerns, though, about how a house cannot be divided, one free and one slave. He believed that the Union's future was in jeopardy because half of it was free and half of it was slave. Not that he gave like a position on what they should do about it, but Southerners used this justification as that, well, Abraham Lincoln then wants to free all the slaves because he believes that we can't be successful in the future where slavery exists. And I feel like that's probably a fair argument, but I still don't think that Lincoln had the intention of freeing slaves up until he was kind of forced to do so during the war. So the Freeport Doctrine was at one particular part of the debate where Lincoln challenged Douglas on his opinion of popular sovereignty in the Dred Scott decision. So he basically kind of drew Douglas into this mistake where he kind of backpedals on the institution. For Douglas, slavery, he didn't really care about slavery in the West. All Douglas really cared about was his railroad and his state and like making money. And so when he was kind of called out on it, like take a position, Douglas talked about how in the end, he basically said like, well, slavery doesn't have to exist if local citizens pass laws to maintain it. Like the federal government can say that slavery exists in Wisconsin territory, but if the people of Wisconsin don't pass laws that guarantee the slavery, then we don't have to worry about it. And Southern Democrats, because remember, he is a Democrat, so Southerners called him out and said, no, you need to be pro Dred Scott. You need to be pro expansion. And so this debate, even though it's about Illinois, is actually, again, kind of this microcosm for the debate that's going to happen in the presidential election in 1860, because these men are going to run against each other again for president in 1860. Lincoln loses. Illinois likes Douglas. They like his experience. They like the economic part with the railroads and all of that. But Lincoln and his words and his oratory are going to be used to kind of launch him into the spotlight. So the 1858 congressional races, Republicans did really well. They took back a lot of seats, and this is, again, like alarming Southerners. The platform talks about tariffs, which, again, Southerners say that hurts them. And so Southerners start talking about a Republican victory in 1860, and they believe, and what they're trying to kind of justify, is that it could harm their economic interests and the constitutional right to hold slaves. They saw the success of the Republican Party as a direct threat to their economic institution and their social institutions. In addition to that, you have people like John Brown who are behaving in a way that increases the worry and the reaction of Southerners in a defensive way. So John Brown, abolitionist, we talked about what he did in Kansas, the Potawatomi Massacre. Now he's in Virginia, and he has decided that he can't do it himself, right? He can't abolish slavery himself. God has told him to abolish slavery or to do what he can. So he has decided that he is going to arm enslaved people in Virginia and create kind of like what happened in Haiti, to where the enslaved people need to rise up. They just need weapons and they need leadership, and that they are going to take their freedom. it doesn't work so well because the plantations that he goes to, that people are like, no, like, we don't want anything to do with you. Like, you're a crazy white guy. They've seen what happens to people that, or to enslaved people that rebel. And so he raised a federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Again, his goal was to try and arm people. They didn't follow him. He's surrounded by Robert E. Lee. And after 2 days, they surrender. He is eventually convicted of treason and is executed. Northerners will condemn him. And so it's very similar to, like, when you think about, when we go back to the Revolutionary War, like the violence. So we think about the Boston Tea Party. Like, most people did not agree with John Brown. There were some Northern, like, anti-slavery supporters and abolitionists that did support him and kind of saw him as a martyr. I think that it's a little, and he was glorified. Like, there were songs, the Republic, there's a famous song where it talks about glory, glory, hallelujah, his soul is marching on, that was used during the Civil War. It's still, like, kind of this patriotic song today. And that was talking about John Brown. Southern whites see him and use him as an example, almost too much so that, like, all Northerners supported him, and that just wasn't the case. But they're like, yep, see, they're coming after our slaves. They're going to incite slave revolts, and, like, we got to get out of here. And that's one of the things that they're going to kind of use to justify secession. So we've talked about how the Whig Party was divided over the issue of slavery expanding, and they're pretty much gone. You really have the Republican Party as the dominant party to kind of replace them. The Democratic Party is also divided, almost in these two factions of Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. Northern Democrats, their view is going to be more pushing the idea of, like, popular sovereignty and letting the people of those districts decide, even though they're in the wake of the Dred Scott decision. Southerners are adamant that slavery needs to exist in the West and that it's a constitutional issue. And then they're also really worried about the Republicans winning, and they want to make sure that their interests are being addressed within the Democratic Party. So Stephen Douglas is the most experienced leading candidate. Did really well in the Illinois Senate race, and so going into the convention in Baltimore, Maryland, he's kind of the guy. However, Southern delegates walk out of the convention because they don't want anything to do with popular sovereignty. Instead, they hold their own convention in Charleston later, and they end up nominating John C. Breckinridge, and it's pro-expansion. They're out of the woodwork now, and they're no longer hiding the fact that they want Cuba, to annex Cuba, and to consider that a slave state. And so this political cartoon that you see right here is Douglas trying to appease the Southerners. So one of the things that from this time period that enslaved people in cities like Charleston and Baltimore and Savannah is that sometimes African American or enslaved people and free blacks, if that existed, which did not in South Carolina, but they would be allowed to go out and earn money in different ways. One of the ways in Charleston Market, if you've ever been to Charleston, you probably know what I'm talking about, but that's one of the places where enslaved people would go in order to earn extra money. And most of the time it had something to do with entertainment. And basically what it was they would dance and sing and kind of make a fool of themselves, because that's what the white people would want them to do, to the point where they could earn money, or in this regard, like food. So they would, people would toss them, they would buy them produce or eels or something like that, to where they could then take that back home and use it to supplement for their family. And so this cartoon is making fun of Stephen Douglas about how he basically went, is trying to appease Southerners by doing this dance for him in order to kind of get them on his side. And it ended up not working. So this is mocking Stephen Douglas. It's also mocking how whites treated African Americans in Southern cities. So the Republican platform is, again, protective tariffs, free land for homesteaders. So we're going to eventually have the Homestead Act, a transcontinental railroad. It's very similar to the Whig Party, you'll start to notice. But in addition to that, the anti-expansion of slavery. It's going to appeal to Northerners and Westerners. They easily nominate Abraham Lincoln because of his debate skills. They think it's also going to carry a lot of those Midwestern states that they need. And we began a campaign that was pretty intense, and it was very divided, especially what was going on with the Democratic Party. Now, in response to this, a new political party, a fourth party, shows up because they are worried that the Republicans will win. They don't really agree with the Democrats. They don't really agree with the Republicans, but they're worried that secession will happen if Lincoln wins, which it does. So you have former Whigs, know nothings. You have moderate Democrats. Their number one goal is to uphold the Constitution, preserve the Union. They nominate John Bell from Tennessee. Abraham Lincoln is going to carry every single northern state. Okay, not a single electoral vote will come from the South for Abraham Lincoln. He'll win 59% of the electoral votes and just under 40% of the popular vote because it was split between the four candidates. Breckinridge is going to carry the South. And now this is one of those situations with, if you add popular vote with Stephen Douglas, he would have had more popular votes than Lincoln, but Lincoln still would have carried the Electoral College. So here's the reality, right? Reality check for Southerners. Free states now have enough electoral votes to select a president without the need for the South. Because remember, popular vote doesn't count. So Southerners really felt as though they didn't really have a chance to even win any presidential elections in the future, especially if more free states are added and more electoral votes are given that way. And so that is why South Carolina, in December of 1860, secedes with the Union. Within 6 weeks, your deep South states are of Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. They're all going to also secede. And in February of 1861, they are going to send delegates to Montgomery, Alabama, and they are going to form the Confederate States of America. Now, all of this happens before any shots are fired. The United States has not recognized such a thing. And basically what they do, like, what does it mean to secede? Well, basically these states seize federal buildings, post offices, custom houses, forts, things like that. And that's pretty much the transition. Buchanan does absolutely nothing. Okay. They don't recognize the Confederate States. He doesn't do anything because it's that lame duck session. The Crittenden Compromise was one more attempt to appease Southerners with a constitutional amendment that would guarantee the right to hold slaves in territories south of that 3630 line. So basically, Crittenden came up with this idea of, like, okay, one of the reasons Southerners are seceding is because they're worried that Congress might one day abolish slavery in those states, even though that was something that Lincoln did not campaign on. So what if we have a constitutional amendment that protects that? Northerners completely dismissed it. It didn't even have a shot at passing. But Southerners who did vote for secession, they believed that that there was an abuse of power, and so they kind of like referenced the Declaration of Independence, that this Northern rule was a sense of tyranny, just like how the British monarchy had a sense of tyranny. Here's the thing, though. In the 1770s and 1776, when we declared independence from Britain, the number one issue was the fact that there was no representation in Parliament. Okay, they had lost autonomy. There was a lack of sense of democracy, of republicanism, and that's all that they really wanted. Like, yes, they were upset about taxes, but the root of it was the lack of representation. In this case, for Southerners, in these southern states, they had representation. It just so happened that they were in the minority and that they had lost. And a lot of historians believe that South Carolina overreacted, that if maybe they had not seceded and they had just let Lincoln be president and let the West continue to add on its free states, there are historians that have predicted that slavery could have existed in these southern states for decades, up until 1900 is what they were, because a lot of Northerners just kind of turned a blind eye to it. And it's interesting to see that, they overreacted, because they lost, and that ended up making it worse for them. And as we talk about the Civil War and the effects of that and Reconstruction in the next part, like the next lectures to follow, you'll start to see how maybe Southern states made it worse for them. Now, the positive light, on the positive side, is that slavery will be ended, because once war starts, slaves were being used to help the war effort. So the United States and Lincoln and the Union Army, they're going to try to abolish slavery in order to help the war effort. But if South Carolina had never seceded, they probably could have carried on their way of life for decades to come. Okay, so in the next lecture, we'll talk about the Civil War, the effects, the battles, what it was like to live during the Civil War. And I hope you learned something today, and I'll see you next time. Bye.